Okay, Louis. So you hired David to paint the Oath of Hirati so that we, people of France, would want to unquestionably die for our kingdom and our king. Why? Because there's a lot of problems in France at this time. You remember? Remember when I was talking about the cultural context for France? Louis and the Queen. They were completely isolated from the trials and issues of the French people, and the same corrupt government and removal from reality that we saw in Louis XIV was continued in Louis XV's reign and has continued into Louis XVI's reign. It's also exacerbated by that economic depression caused by the funding of the American Revolution and the severe food shortage. I mentioned that there were inflation rates at this time. The two of them had no concept at one point to show their solidarity with the starving people of France. They agreed to 1 day fasting a week. They were like, oh, 1 day a week we won't eat anything. Now, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, this did save a lot of money because it was so much money to feed them for that 1 day with these massive feasts. But still, I mean, come on, like 1 day a week, and that's how you're gonna reform or help us? This system of government we often refer to as the Ancien Régime, which is your next vocab term. Ancien Régime, the French older order, the ancient order, Ancien Régime, ancient power. The term is used specifically to describe the political, social, and religious orders in France before the revolution. Now, I keep on talking about this revolution, revolutionary ideas, because, well, remember the system of government during the Ancien Régime? First estate, the religious order, which in France was very firmly Catholic. The second estate, the second class, the royalty and nobility, they, using the corruption of taxation, were living in the lap of luxury on the broken backs of everyone else, the peasant and working class, the third estate. What we have here is not what the Enlightenment was proclaiming to be truth and honesty. Remember, Voltaire, Rousseau, and John Locke, all of them arguing that government should serve the people, and if government does not serve the people, government needs to change, and the people have the right to change it. Uh-oh. So what we have is brewing resentment and anger for the Ancien Regime. Now, our next series of slides or images I'm going to put up are going to be artworks, but I'm not giving you any captions or, sorry, artist titles, dates, because it's not about that. I'm giving you a quick rundown or a Cliff Notes version of the French Revolution and the lead up to that French Revolution. So let's go together. Here we are. The ideas of the Enlightenment are brewing in the people of France. In fact, they just helped with the funding of another revolution in America. So they turn to themselves and they say, wait a minute, this isn't okay. The Ancien Régime needs to change. In June of 1789, members of the three estates, the aristocracy, the church, and the commoners, they arrive at the Palace of Versailles to hold an Estates General. An Estates General is a representative assembly. Think of them like an advisory council. And this advisory council had been established before Louis XIV, but it had not been enacted, or it had not performed its duties since Louis XIV. Remember, Louis XIV, our Sun King, he always had these suspicions about the nobility, and he always wanted to keep them busy with doing things like brushing out his wigs, right? So this policy of advisory council to the king had been established but had not been utilized in over 100 years. It's called the Estates General. Now, the Estates General was a representative of the commoners, the third estate, the first estate, the religious, the church, and the aristocracy. Now, members of each of these classes went to Versailles, and the idea was that they would want to negotiate or talk or advise with Louis XVI. But Louis, he's such a little brat, or I should say, a big fat brat, because remember the courtiers called him a big fat pig. They said he ate like a monkey. Ugh, it was gross. He would eat sweets until he puked. Anyways, so they went to Versailles and they're like, Louis, we need to talk. Can we get this Estates General in order? And Louis was like, later. And he kept on putting it off. And so they got fed up and they went into the Versailles tennis court, and together they made an oath to fix the government. This is called the Tennis Court Oath because it happened in the tennis courts of Versailles. What we see here in this drawing by David is a preparatory drawing for what he wanted to do in a later painting. And this is the tennis court. Ms. Cortez, this is not what a tennis court looks like. This is proto-tennis as we know it. Early forms of tennis were done in these kind of indoor settings, almost like racquetball. So anyways, the tennis court oath. And what we see in this illustration here are the three estates have met and declared to change government. Now, their ideas of changing the government was basically to establish a constitutional monarch. So rather than an absolute monarch, he, the king, would need to work with a system of government, not just an advisory council. Something similar to what Parliament was with the monarch in England. Okay. So this tennis court oath happens in June, but it's not enough and it's not progressing very fast. So on July 14th of that same year, revolutionaries in Paris, aggravated and frustrated with the slow moving of government and change, attack this Bastille. The Bastille was an armory. It was an old fortress on the outskirts of Paris, and it had been most recently served as a prison for political prisoners, and it became a representation or a symbol of French government censorship. And so the revolutionaries in Paris are like, things aren't changing fast enough. We need to have more aggressive change. And so they attack Bastille and they storm it, and it's supposed to be this like fantastic thing. And in fact, the storming of the Bastille marks the beginning of the revolution in France and still celebrated as their day of independence. This definitely catches the attention of the king and the Estates General to ramp up. So in August, they start their meetings, and this is officially called the National Constituent Assembly. So here in this illustration, we see members of the three estates, and they're meeting with the king. There he is. But during these meetings, many were criticizing the king because he was distracted. He was even more distracted, or what's the word? Lacking focus and decision-making skills, even worse than before. The reason, or at least one of the reasons, is because his son, Louis, the heir to the throne, had just died. Little Louis died at 7 years old back in June. So he's a father grieving the loss of his son and the heir to France. Now, there is a second son, little Louis, but I'm not defending the king in any way, but that is a factor we need to take into consideration. So as these assembly meetings are continuing, the people of France are getting more and more frustrated. In October 5th, 1789, the women march from Paris to Versailles. It's referred to as the Women's March on Versailles. Now, this was part of a larger discussion of inflation and the lack of reliable food sources, especially in the city of Paris, where all of this had to be carted in. The women of France are expected to feed their families, and they were paying these exorbitant amounts of money for these really crappy loaves of bread and rotten fruit. The loaves of bread, they discuss them in their journals. The bakers didn't have enough wheat or grain to make proper bread. And so they would put in fillers like rocks and chalk, and this like junk bread they're paying through the roof for. So the women of Paris were like, you know what, that's it. They marched from Paris to Versailles, which would be a full day. And when they got to the Palace of Versailles, they told the royal family, you obviously do not get it. This is taking way too long. How about you get back to Paris, which is officially the capital of the nation, and you start to really focus on fixing this. It's during the Women's March that, if you've ever seen Sofia Coppola's movie Marie Antoinette, this is one of the final scenes. It's so fantastic. The mob is just outside of Versailles, and Louis and Marie and their two surviving children, come out onto this balcony with, oh gosh, what's his name? Oh, goodness gracious. I really love French Revolution, so I'm getting a little excited. Lafayette, General Lafayette. General Lafayette, if you are also interested in United States history, General Lafayette was a French general who was sent to help the American revolutionaries fight against Britain. And he came back a massive war hero, and he was with the king and queen in Versailles when the march happened, and he told Marie and Louis, the mob is mad, go out onto the balcony to show that you're not afraid and that you're willing to work with them. Now, in Sofia Coppola's movie, Marie Antoinette kind of dramatically drapes over the balcony, and it's kind of foreshadowing of her death. That didn't really happen. In Marie Antoinette's journals, she did say that she did not like this. She felt very unsafe, and she didn't trust Lafayette. So, the king and queen are carted back to Paris. Well, not carted. They're taken back to one of their many palaces in Paris. And negotiations continue for 2 years. And in that 2-year period, more and more people are becoming upset and frustrated with the king and queen. So what is their response? They leave. They run away. On June 20th, 1791, the royal family, in the middle of the night, gather up 2 carriages and outfit them with their butlers and their direct servants, and they, in disguise, run out of Paris, and remarkably, they make it all the way to a border town. Now, their plan is to escape to a country that is aligned with Marie Antoinette. Remember, she is the Empress of Austria's daughter. And at a border town, stupid Louis, our king, he's like, oh my gosh, I'm in disguise. This is so great. He stops at this border town for a sandwich. Think of this like a rest stop, and he's in disguise, and he's talking with the locals, and he's like, all right, and he pays for his food, and then he gets back in the carriage, and he's like, that was great. They didn't even know it was Louis. Oh my gosh. And then the people are like, was that the king? 2 carriages with servants, butler, horsemen, 2 kids. I think that was the king. That's him on this money, isn't it? So they call the guards, 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 and the guards catch them right before they make it across the border, and they bring them back to France. Now, this time, they do cart them back, and they imprison them in one of their palaces in Paris. They imprison them in Tuileries Palace. Now, contemporary accounts of their escape by people who kept, journals and stuff, their diaries, people describing the news that the king had tried to basically run away from the nation. It was painful for them. Many described it as a father abandoning their family. And many of their supporters who had wanted to maintain authority in the monarchy, they now did not trust their king, and it really put in the death nail for any hope of return to power for Louis. Now you might be thinking, well, what was happening outside of France? Like, wasn't anybody mad? Yeah, remember, Marie Antoinette has some powerful family members. Prussia and Austria declared war on the French revolutionaries. Now, Prussia is a distant relative of Marie Antoinette, but Marie's brother is now Emperor Joseph of Austria, and she's got a ton of other brothers in Austria, so they're super mad. Louis's younger brothers, his younger brothers are Louis and Charles. They barely escape with their lives, and they're trying to rally other nations to help support and declare war on the revolutionaries. But you know what? So many people hate France at this time. Well, they turn to France for like culture and art. They also are jealous or envious or just downright hate the French. So they don't want to help. They're just like, too bad. Like the British, England is not going to come in and help. England's like, what? Oh, it's too bad. You got a revolution on your hands. Oh, we had one too, and you paid for it. So this war against the revolutionaries doesn't scare the revolutionaries. Instead, the revolutionaries abolish the French monarchy. They're like, you know what? We don't need a king at all. And they declare themselves a republic, a representative government. And they declare war on the Holy Roman Empire in Prussia. Holy Roman Empire, which is Joseph II. Oh my goodness. Now, in this image here, I'm showing you one of the leading star generals of the French Revolution at this time. You know him, and we're going to talk about him extensively later. But in this younger version of him, do you recognize him? It's Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was a soldier for the French army, and during this revolution and the declaration of war against the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon starts to stand out as a key general, and he is just victory after victory. He's been stationed in south of France and specifically their Italian border, and he is just a star general, and he has such loyal soldiers. We're going to come back to him. He's going to come up again. But if we've established a republic and we've taken out the monarchy, then what are we supposed to do with our king? We don't need him anymore. On January 21st, 1793, they execute him. They stand him on trial the day before as a traitor to the Republic, which, I mean, that's obvious. He's the king, so why would he be in support of this Republic? So they find him guilty for treason against the Republic, and they sentence him to death. Now, the death penalty at this time is this new, more humane contraption called a guillotine. What? A new humane form of execution? The guillotine, which you'll see images in the next slide, the guillotine is a framed blade that is a weighted blade that is dropped on your head, and it slices you right on your neck. So you lay with your head in this little framework, and then the weighted blade comes down and it cleanly slices it off. How was this humane? Well, prior to the invention of the guillotine, you would have an executioner with an axe. And the executioner would have to hopefully aim correctly to chop off your head. Now, this was seen as more humane because, so gross, but totally true, executioners would miss oftentimes. I mean, this is a scary situation to be in. It's always a crowd, and then you're meant to like kill a king, and so they'd have their axe and they might miss with their first and like take off an ear or hack at your back, and like, you know, you just like, it's just gross. And so the guillotine was seen as much more swift, clean. Also, it removed the direct contact for the executioner, because executioners were often ostracized from society because of their job. So, with this more humane guillotine, they killed a king. Now, descriptions of the event describe Louis going up to the guillotine and proclaiming, quote, "I die perfectly innocent of the so-called crimes for which I am accused, and I pardon those who are the cause of my misfortune." He then declared himself willing to die, and he prayed that the people of France would be spared a similar fate. After his head was cut off, they lifted his head up and they swung it over the crowds, and people were just bloodthirsty and angry, and they were swiping to catch the drips of the blood, and people saved the claws. They were dabbing it from their shirts and on their skin. They're like, "King's blood, king's blood." Ah! What this marks is the beginning of what is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Now, the Reign of Terror lasts for roughly about a year, and as this is described, the Reign of Terror is this widespread panic across France. It's estimated that about 16,500 people died under the guillotine in Paris alone. And historians estimate that the number of people murdered either by slaughtering by mobs or crushed in riots or murdered in their own beds during this 1 year is about 40,000 people, and that's a conservative estimate. During this Reign of Terror, people were gathered up and proclaimed to be threats to the Republic. This Reign of Terror was led chiefly by this government official here, Robespierre. Robespierre was a very interesting figure. He had been a government official, a politician, I should say, under the Estates General, and we don't really know a lot about him other than that. We don't know a lot about his personal life. He seems to have been kind of a very meek, mild-mannered figure before the revolution. He had a very high-pitched voice. But he really took over during the revolution, became one of its leading members. Under him, Robespierre, and his friend, Marat, we have the establishment of the Committee for Public Safety. Oh, that sounds great, right? It's led by two radicals. And Robespierre and Marat was a highly educated political theorist. He wrote radical essays for newspapers and political journals. And I say radical because his articles always spoke of doing violent acts against the enemies of the revolution. He demanded dramatic reforms and was a real extremist. So under the Committee for Public Safety, nobody was safe. Not even Monsieur Lavoisier. He's a tax collector. He's one of the bad guys for this revolution. It doesn't matter if he's the father of chemistry. the mob came into his house in Paris, and Marie Anne and her dad, who was living with them at the time, barely escaped with their lives. The house was turned over and ransacked during the Revolution. Lavoisier was executed, and Marie Anne, while she escaped with her life, after the Revolution, she came back and she spent the rest of her life gathering up his documents and publishing them under his name. Another to not escape, Madame du Barry. She is the one who was a lover of Louis XV. Now, by the time of the Revolution, she's an older lady and she's just living a very quiet life in a chateau in the middle of France. But she is a symbol of the Ancien Regime. So she is taken from her chateau, brought to Paris, and murdered. Now, murdered by guillotine. Now, it's said that her last words were, "One moment more, executioner, I beg you." Vigée-Lebrun escaped. Oh, goodness. She barely escaped. Now, in the early stages of the Revolution, one of the things that many people, women, benefited from was that there was universal suffrage, meant that men and women could now vote equally. Also, it allowed for women to initiate divorces. Yeah, before this, only men could initiate divorces in France. And when women were able to initiate divorce, 10,000 divorces in the first few years of the Revolution, including Vigée-Lebrun. She filed for divorce against her husband, who, I didn't even mention him. He was this horrible man. He was a gambler and a drunk, and he was an artist as well, but he was just a terrible guy. So she immediately divorces him, and then she and her daughter escape from France. She lives the rest of her life painting for various courts around Europe. Why does she have to escape with her life? She is too closely aligned with the King and Queen of France, right? She's besties with Marie Antoinette. What about David? David's okay. In fact, David is a firm supporter of the revolution. We'll come back and talk about David and his role in the revolution with our next artwork, because I have gone insanely over time. 27 minutes? Oh, goodness.